a little over 25 years ago, viewers who were tuned into ABC were startled when anchor Peter Jennings interrupted with a special report. Few expected to ever hear his opening words in their lifetime. He began, "Today, the East German authorities have said in essence that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything." On NBC, Tom Brokaw was doing his own report. He had gone over to the area to cover protests that were happening at that time. And he reported in front of a scene that few would have imagined, in front of the Berlin Wall itself, with West Berliners in the streets celebrating, and both the young of East and West Berlin on top of the wall, dancing in joy. The Berlin Wall had gone up overnight in August of 1961. Berlin itself was surrounded by East Germany and had been divided along the rest of Germany after World War II into zones by the Allies. The intention had been that this would speed along the rebuilding and eventually the reuniting of the country. However, in 1949, when the Western zones were reunited into West Germany, the Soviet Union held on to East Germany. At that time, travel was still allowed between East and West Germany with passports. And so many East Germans began using this as a route for defection, passing legally over to the city, and once there, being secretly flown to West Germany. By 1961, East Germany had lost 2.1 million people this way, mostly the young or the well-educated. So on August 12th, 1961, government officials desperate to end this brain drain sent tanks and construction equipment rolling through the streets of East Berlin in the middle of the night while the residents slept. By the time East Berliners awoke the next morning, a 4-foot wide and high wire-barbed fence had been erected between the two cities. East Germans who had been employed previously in West Berlin were suddenly unemployed. Any East German resident who had been working or visiting West Berlin that night were permanently separated from their loved ones. And the same was true for West Berliners unlucky enough to be visiting in East Berlin that night. Within 2 weeks, the first concrete wall replaced the barbed wire fence. Later, they added a second wall encircling the first, and it created a dead man zone in which those attempting to leave were shot. Over the time, this zone was reinforced with anti-vehicle mines, watchtowers with armed guards, guard dogs, and razor wire. And though several checkpoints were established, these were open only to foreigners, authorities, and a few select residents. As a result, the wall became a symbol not only of the division itself of the city, but of the so-called Iron Curtain between the US and the Soviet Union and their allied countries. But that changed on November 9th, 1989. While there had been cracks in other parts of the Iron Curtain, East German authorities were convinced that they only needed to institute some moderate reforms to quell the protests that had sprung up. Earlier that day, they had met to begin working on what those reforms would be and decided that one reform was that the government would soon begin issuing passports, allowing people to travel from one side of the city to the next. So as the rest of the government met to hammer out these details, they sent out official Gunter Schwabaski to a press conference to give a progress report on all the reforms that were happening at that time. Being a bureaucrat, he started droning through a script that he hadn't had time to read before he'd gotten on stage. A reporter interrupted him and asked if these reforms included travel restrictions. So shuffling through his papers, he located the part about the travel restrictions and started to read. As he reached the part about the issuing of passports, reporters perked up and began shouting questions. Schabowski became confused, and his comrade sitting beside him remained silent, of no help. He overlooked the portion of the script that said that applying for passports would be necessary and that would start the next day. So when asked when would the travel restrictions be lifted, he said it would begin immediately. Years later, he explained, what was I to do? I couldn't exactly say, oh, no, never mind. Schabowski ended the press conference, but did meet briefly with reporter Tom Brokaw. Schabowski didn't have a strong grasp of English, so when Brokaw asked him if this meant freedom of travel from East to West Berlin and back, he answered just with a yes, and then returned to the government meetings behind closed doors that were taking place. The leaders from those meetings didn't emerge until it was too late to stop the momentum. Meanwhile, Brokaw shouted at the journalists who were inquiring, "It's true, the wall is coming down." On both sides of the wall, Berliners began to hear reports that the checkpoints were now open to free travel. As the crowds of people wanting to cross over to see if this was really true from East to West Berlin and back home, as they grew at the checkpoints, the guards were left without any further instructions. Senior officers at the checkpoints began to fear what would happen as the crowds grew and the guards with guns became more nervous. So one by one, up and down the wall, each decided to open the gates and let the people flow through freely. Soon, East Berliners were flowing down the streets of West Berlin to the welcoming cheers of the residents there, and climbing upon the wall itself to dance in joy, a wall that just the day before they would have been shot for breaching. And though it took several years for the physical wall, the concrete slabs to all be removed, for all intents and purposes, that night the dividing wall between the two people was demolished. For within a year, Berlin itself and Germany had been reunited. Our reading from the letter to the Ephesians describes a different sort of reunion that was also made possible by the unexpected toppling of a wall. At the time the letter was written, Jews and Israels and Gentiles everywhere else viewed each other with great contempt. The animosity was centuries old and had become deeply embedded in their cultural understandings of how they were to interact, or more likely, not interact with each other. Any interactions that did happen between them included a strong undercurrent of suspicion and hostility. Peace was kept between them by the Roman Empire, as it was throughout the empire, but only through threats and violence. And far from unique, the divide between these two groups reflect the way groups throughout history have partitioned themselves from one another using judgment and isolation. As a busy seaport, Ephesus was filled with both Jews and Gentiles. Even as they started to become part of these new Christian communities, the division and conflicts remained. Each group believed that it would be declared the correct followers of the new way, and the other side inferior and made to conform. But the author of Ephesians holds a surprise for them, declaring a different reality. Perhaps he was thinking of the wall in the Jerusalem temple that divided the court of the Gentiles from the inner worship space for the Jews. But he declares that through Christ, God has broken down the dividing wall between them, and they are reconciled in peace. They are already one and freed to live in that way. Few at that time probably anticipated this. Fewer probably even wanted it. These were groups who had loathed each other and couldn't even stand to be physically near each other. And now they were to share food and worship that included physical greetings of peace. Now they were being told that reconciliation wasn't some future dream, and that the peace wouldn't be the lifting up of one group who would subjugate the others. Instead, they were told reconciliation and peace had already happened. It had been accomplished by God. While the norms of the surrounding culture might still designate winners and losers, insiders and outsiders, Christians were to live in this new, God-given reality. And they were to do this by showing the same sort of love and welcome with each other that Jesus had showed the crowds that followed him. Jesus felt compassion so profoundly for the crowds that he felt it in his gut, and he couldn't leave them in their pain, despite his own desires to give himself and his disciples a break. The good news for the Ephesians was that they didn't have to do anything to bring about the reconciliation. God had accomplished it through Christ. They only needed to live within it. On the night that the Berlin Wall fell, West Berlin Mayor Walter Momper recalled looking out over the streets of the city after the press conference had ended and thinking, everything looks the same as ever in this divided city. And though he was skeptical after years of distrust, right there, Momper decided on a motto he was going to take for the evening: act as if. Act as if the news was true, and so encouraged West Berliners to go out and celebrate their reunion with East Berliners. Act as if he was certain that the border was open, and the only questions that remained were questions about the practicalities of how to live that out. In a sense, this is what the passage in Ephesians calls us to do today, to act as if. To act as if that through Christ, it is true that God has torn down that dividing wall of hostility between us, and it no longer exists. It doesn't matter if those walls have been built by concrete, or hostility, or suspicion, or even ignorance. We are called to act as if humanity has been reunited already as one people, one extended family, and all that remains for us to figure out is how we live the practicalities of that out. Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed these sorts of practicalities being worked out in South Carolina, often slowly and painfully. There is deep grief over the deaths of 9 people who opened their hearts to welcome a stranger who then killed them only because their color of their skin was different. But there's also been great grace displayed at times by much of that community and even by our nation. Victims' relatives went to the suspect's arraignment as much to express forgiveness to the suspect as to look for justice for their loved ones. Resulting talks about the place of race in our country and in our history have at times been hostile, but given the past, I think they still seem surprisingly weighted a little more towards listening than shouting or digging in deeper to long-held convictions than they have in the past. One display of such grace has been the manner in which the removal of the Confederate flag flying on the grounds of South Carolina State House was handled. For me, the grace is not in whether or not this flag was removed, but in how and why they did it. Governor Nikki Haley, in her call to take down the flag, started out by talking about those in South Carolina who do respect the flag as part of their heritage. She says those South Carolinians view the flag as a memorial, a way to honor ancestors who came to the service of their state during a time of conflict. She continued, that is not hate, nor is it racism. But then she went on. For many others of South Carolina, the flag is a deeply offensive symbol of a brutally oppressive past. As a state, we can survive while still being home to both these viewpoints. We do not need to declare a winner and loser here. Then, while calling for respect for personal displays of the Confederate flag on private property, she acknowledged that the flying of the flag on State House grounds was different. The State House is supposed to be a gathering place for all South Carolinians and should be safe for all residents, she explained. Flying that flag there kept it from feeling that way for too many of the state's residents. My hope, she said, is that by removing a symbol that divides us, we can move forward in a state of harmony. In private talks over the next week with lawmakers, she would relate to them her time as a young Indian girl going to a fruit stand and stopping there to buy produce with her father. The owner called the police. The young Nikki was scared as her father was confronted by 2 police officers for the offense of having a different skin color than the owners. She said she still feels that pain whenever she drives by that fruit stand. And so I reminded them that the State House belongs to everyone, and no child should drive by the State House and feel pain. And so well over 2/3 of the state legislature, their eyes open to another person's pain, took an act of compassion, and lived out for at least a moment the reality that they are all one state. They were able to see through the dividing wall, see their brother and sister hurting, and decide that no matter what their personal beliefs were, the pain of their brother and sister was enough to take action. What if we actually acted as if we know the wall of hostility between people is gone, already demolished by God? We don't need to do that. How would it be if we lived as peace has already been made between all people? And what if, like the vast majority of the South Carolina legislature, our eyes were open to each other's pain, and we were moved to act, even if it were against our own self-interest? The letter from Ephesians argues that we are already living in a God-made reality of a world where all barriers, economic, social, racial, ethnic, any type of barrier that we have built in the past between people has already been demolished. And all that is left for us is working on the practicalities of living that out. Archbishop Desmond Tutu lived out the scenario as apartheid was being dismantled in South Africa. He once said, "God saw our brokenness and sought to extricate us from it, but only with our cooperation. God will not cajole or bully us, but wants to woo us for our own sake." Ephesians describes this as God joining and growing people and a world into a dwelling place of God. God is wooing all of us, all people, to leave the rubble of the wall behind and live in the peace that is already here. The dividing wall of hate and hostility has, in essence, been declared to not mean anything anymore. Perhaps it's time for us to figure out the practicalities of living in this new age, where people of all types and all beliefs are one dwelling place for God, united as one. Amen. I just want to reiterate first that I use that illustration of South Carolina taking down the Confederate flag not because of I'm on one side or the other. If you're interested to know which side I am on, you can ask me later. But if the result had been different or had been the same, and there had been great animosity and hate behind it, I would not have used it as an example. What touched me was the grace of what happens when we get together and see our brother or sister in each other. On the night that the Berlin Wall fell, there was a 35-year-old physicist who heard the news, but she had a Thursday night appointment with a spa and plans to meet her friends at the bar for suds, as she called it. And being the practical German, she kept her plans. Afterwards, however, she walked up and down the streets in East Berlin, marveling at what had happened. That East Berlin physicist is Angela Merkel, the current chancellor of the United Germany. What walls are we building and maintaining that are keeping us from seeing someone who has something to give us, someone who can help unite us as one? The walls are demolished. We can step over the rubble, and we can reach out to the other side. May God bless you and keep you until we meet again.